Well, happy Sunday, Martin Luther King Day Eve. Martin Luther King Jr., for a long time in congregations like this, wasn't really considered, as far as I know, a controversial figure. We have the reading in our book, which is sort of like it's culled from a bunch of different sources. And we could do the responsive reading. And in recent years, one of the things that has come up is that because Dr. King was such an advocate for nonviolence, it has been seen that sometimes well-meaning or not so well-meaning white people use his words to tone police or in other ways tell communities of color how they should or should not act. So Dr. King has, maybe the controversy was already there, but some of us didn't know about it. But he's actually become, I have to give this talk, I don't know if that's awkward for any of you. I think it's kind of illuminating, but I have to give this little blurb beforehand because what I'm going to try to do, I was wondering who the heck is texting me 1,000 times. Okay, what I'm going to try to do, it wasn't about the sermon, so I can go on, is to not cherry pick too much according to my views. That's what I'm going to try to do, but it is important for us to recognize that social location is a thing. White privilege is a thing. And so I'm seeing this work through a filter, and my main point today is that I think you should read the book I'm going to tell you all about. I'm going to give you my book report. I'm going to try to do a really great job like Mr. Smith taught me in 9th grade to do an oral book report. And my main thing is go take a look at the source material, draw your own conclusions, ask Dr. King scholars of color what their conclusions are, and educate yourself so that you can engage in discussions in compassionate ways. But also it's a great time, it's a great era for people who look like me to step back. So with that said, let's enjoy some of the words from Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., famous civil rights activist. Okay, so the book I'm talking about is called Where Will We Go From Here? Chaos or Community? And this was the last book that Dr. King wrote before he was assassinated. So it's, it was the sort of most up-to-date of his thinking that we have. And as I read this, I found what I think you'll find when you read it. It's quite relevant to issues that face us right now. So I'm going to give you a chapter by chapter synopsis with some quotes, and hopefully that'll be as fun as I thought it was going to be when I was writing these notes. If not, it's only going to last 20 minutes and we could do it. We can do hard things like Glennon Doyle taught me. So chapter 1 is called Where Are We? And as any good speaker and logician, he first lays out what's the situation as he sees it. In this chapter, Dr. King jumps straight into a very important topic, which is going to be a theme throughout the rest of the book. At that time, a very important topic was what they called the white backlash, a white backlash. And I imagine in our modern times, this makes sense to us, because it was the notion that after so many gains of African-American peoples, that then there was this big pushback from people who were not comfortable with that degree of equality. So right off the bat, he gets into the idea of the white backlash, and a lot of this book is, where might that be coming from? I can't help but see parallels with our own recent history of electing America's first Black president for 2 terms, which was immediately followed by the good people on both sides era of making America great again. and the empowerment, America first, right? The old KKK slogan. That was the slogan upon which the 45th president of America was elected on a KKK slogan. It's really hard not to see a white backlash in that. I think we've all gotten a bit wiser in the last 6 years, but for a minute, this was extremely confusing to a lot of well-meaning white liberals. What in the world happened? But way back in the 1960s, Dr. King was already describing this phenomenon. It was not unknown to some other citizens of the United States. He writes about his time. White America would have liked to believe that in the past 10 years, a mechanism had somehow been created that needed only orderly and smooth tending for the painless accomplishment of change. I mean, wouldn't that have been nice? We're done. It's Obama and the Supreme Court, did the cool gay marriage thing they did in 2015. And all we have to do is sort of just keep tending the flame and it'll take care of itself. Unfortunately, that's not the case. Dr. King goes on to make the point that allies of his time were willing to jump in and help the dramatic struggle against obvious mistreatment in the southern states. But but he makes clear that the subtler systematic or institutional racism did not arouse the same level of activism from allies. It's timely. It's extremely timely. He makes the point, another of my favorite points in this first chapter, he makes the point that at the time of the framing of the Constitution, enslaved people of African descent were considered 60% of a person for tax purposes. We all know this terrible arithmetic. Dr. King goes on then to make the point that during these times, in terms of equality, during his times, in terms of equality, our society considers people of African descent to be 50% of a person, citing such figures as that twice as many Black Americans served in Vietnam as white Americans. He cites other figures such as infant mortality and makes the case that in terms of social equality, African Americans were 50% of a person. I can't help but think that this inquiry remains relevant today, as things like sentencing severity, stop and frisk racial profiling, and death at the hands of police officers are all handed out disproportionately to Black Americans. Here I see Dr. King making early arguments for the value of the motto, Black Lives Matter. He points out too, why that motto should remain so triggering to a sector of our population who would prefer some type of fascism over racial equality. He says, to them, democracy is not worth having if it involves equality. The segregationist goal is the total reversal of all reforms, with reestablishment of naked oppression, and if need be, a native form of fascism. America had a master race in the antebellum South. Reestablishing it with a resurgent Klan and a totally disenfranchised lower class would realize the dream of too many extremists on the right. It's not an outdated book. But being Dr. King, he finishes the chapter by helping us frame troubling reversals from a big picture perspective, reminding us that these revelations of hate are not something newly born, but something being revealed. He makes the point that what seems like a white backlash, that some people were arguing, well, maybe if we frame our actions in this way, maybe if we only do nonviolence, we won't get a white backlash. And then others were saying, maybe, if we do a little more violence, we won't get a white backlash. And Dr. King makes the point that the white backlash was always there. It's just surfacing in relation to the change that's been brought about. He reminds us too that the line of progress is never straight, And a final victory is the result of many short-term encounters. All in all, words that seem extremely relevant to the continuing struggle taking place today. Chapter 1, you got through it. Where are we? What do you think? Does that seem relevant to your experience? I mean, it's great to study our history, but I was really surprised to open this book, to kind of get better in touch with Dr. King, and to go, oh my, like these were words that I needed to hear today. Chapter 2 is titled Black Power. You know, there's some contentious issues coming in chapter 2. In Dr. King's day, many of the same discussions were happening then that are happening now, a major one being, should we stick to nonviolent methods of change, or do violent ones sometimes accomplish more? Obviously, Dr. King defends nonviolence, but what I found interesting is that he gives a lot of airtime to the other views. So he did this really cool, it's like he was like a real Christian or something, at least in writing, that he's saying like, here's my view, but you know, I can see what folks are talking about. Here's why I disagree with it. But what's interesting is even if you wanted to learn the arguments for not nonviolence, you could learn a lot of that from reading Dr. King's book. It's like, to me, that's the sign of like a good ethical debater. Like, you never hear some of these talking head podcasters. You don't come away with really understanding what the other side is saying. You come away with a couple of straw men and then a big appeal to fear. But Dr. King, you know just as well what he thinks, as well as, maybe it's a straw man, but you get a pretty good idea of what his opponents were saying to him at the time. He approaches them with a great deal of empathy. One lesson I think we should take from this chapter, if you're taking notes, what does Reverend Fa Jun think I should take from this chapter? I'm not arguing that you need to remember that, but here's what I think, just in case. One lesson you might take is that in the civil rights era, there was no monolithic Black voice. There, you know, this is one of the ways why Dr. King's voice has become a matter of some controversy, is that there are forces in the world, some benign, some malevolent, some neutral, who would like to say, oh yes, the civil rights era, here's the guy who spoke for all the people of color and can continue to do so if you just don't argue with us. And in fact, there were many, many, many human beings arguing for the value of Black lives in many, many different ways. It's pretty cool, and maybe you already know that, but as the, you know, white pastor of a predominantly white congregation, I have to say it because some, like that people are actively working against those understandings in public school. They're actively trying to make sure you don't think about that in our public school system. So I gotta say it up here. That understanding is part of decolonizing our minds to stop thinking of entire groups of people as having singular voices. It's not a great idea to say, the Native Americans were like this, right? Back in the 90s, there used to be a thing called Native American spirituality. It never really existed, and I hope it doesn't exist anymore, because that's a type of dehumanizing behavior. You're not actually looking at Lakota and Ojibwe and Ohlone people, and within those groups, there were individuals and dissenting voices and stuff like that. You sort of just glomp them together, right? You can't say things like, the civil rights leaders were such a way, because those were a bunch of different human beings. So you can't say that because it's dehumanizing, even if you're saying something that seems nice. What I really enjoyed about this chapter is that Dr. King held up the democratic process as nonviolence in action. Like voting in local and presidential and midterm elections, he held up as the big nonviolent demonstration that everybody should be doing. He didn't say you could stop demonstrating, but he counseled us away from separatism. I mean, even like California seceding from the Union, Dr. King said, it's probably not the best one. We're better off going toward union than we are going toward isolation. And he was in favor of using the massive nonviolent decision-making process we already have in place, regardless of how broken it is, using it more and using it more skillfully. In this chapter, I want to take just one quote, which Dr. King was directing toward those in his era who are in favor of using not nonviolent methodology to establish Black power. But I want to take this quote as aiming toward non-African American allies. Because I have no business telling people who want to use actions to attain Black power. Not my job to tell you what to do. But I can tell people of European descent in America interesting things, and this quote really works well. Dr. King says, the white man, through his own efforts, through education and goodwill, through searching his conscience, and through confronting the fact of integration, must do a great deal to free himself of these paralyzing fears. But to master fear, he must also depend on the spirit that African Americans generate toward him. Only through our adherence to nonviolence, which also means love in its strong and commanding sense, will the fear in the white community be mitigated. So he was talking to an audience of color, but what I want to say to you, the white liberals in the audience, pardon me for singling out one of the groups in the audience. If you're here in a Unitarian Universalist congregation, you've probably had the privilege to deconstruct a bunch of the institutionalized racism that terrifies your peers. It's built in there and it scares the hell out of them, and they don't even know that that's what's scaring them to death. In addition to that, the world likely has enough angry whites. I don't know, we could debate this another time. Send me an email. I think the world has enough angry whites speaking loudly. But I wonder if some of us who are working to try to disentangle ourselves from built-in racism were to non-violently take it on ourselves to talk to other white people who haven't had the privilege and the safety to do that work. If we took it on ourselves to create that safety for them, we might take a major burden of education off the Black community, who has already done enough and still has plenty to do. So I wonder if we could take Dr. King's words to heart ourselves. Dr. King says the beauty of nonviolence is that in its own way and in its own time, it seeks to break the chain reaction of evil. With a majestic sense of spiritual power, it seeks to elevate truth, beauty, and goodness to the throne. Therefore, I continue to follow this method because I think it is the most practically sound and morally excellent way for African Americans to achieve freedom. Quick note, he uses an archaic N-word where I'm saying African Americans. So that was my best substitution. Ultimately, Dr. King argues for restorative justice over retributive. He does not denounce self-defense, but looks to the long term and the type of societies that grow from nonviolence versus the type of societies that grow from violence. Okay, chapter 3, here we go. Chapter 3 is called Racism and... How are we doing? Too boring or too exciting? We're right in the middle. Book report, yes. Here we go. Chapter 3 is called Racism and the White Backlash. Here we get a very important history lesson, some of which many of us have already begun through other sources, but the conclusion is startling. So he's opening salvo right off the bat. Okay, I just want to frame this because it's kind of fun. Like, think of the Dr. King that like you get a day off school because Martin Luther King Day. And a lot of us think like, oh yeah, this friendly guy who doesn't ask us to change very much. At least that's the one I got growing up. Opening salvo, white America must assume the guilt for the Black man's inferior status. White America must assume the guilt for the Black man's inferior status. Let me unpack this a little bit. I love this quote because it upends the forwarding of Dr. King as just the nice guy who's not going to be too mean to the poor white people. This is not a cherry-picked quote that says we should all just get along and forgive and forget, but a historically informed assessment of where our unequal society comes from. What you may also probably not miss is that it's a clap back to the anti-scientific views of the day that said there was somehow an inherent inferiority to people of African descent. This made-up race science, I have to use quotes because it's not a science, was developed by pro-slavery white voices solely for the purpose of justifying oppression and genocide. Dr. King writes, "It seems to be a fact of life that human beings cannot continue to do wrong without eventually reaching out for some rationalization to clothe their acts in the garments of righteousness. And so with the growth of slavery, men had to convince themselves that a system which was so economically profitable was morally justifiable. The attempt to give moral sanction to a profitable system gave birth to the doctrine of white supremacy." After arguing so well for the dream of American democracy in previous chapters, Dr. King goes on to unveil the taint of slavery that poisoned our founding fathers' ideals. He further writes, "To define much of white America as self-deluded on the commitment to equality and to apprehend the broad base on which it rests are not to enthrone pessimism. The racism of today is real, but the democratic spirit that has always faced it is equally real. The value in pulling racism out of its obscurity and stripping it of its rationalizations lies in the confidence that it can be changed. To live with the pretense that racism is a doctrine of a very few is to disarm us in fighting it frontally as scientifically unsound, morally repugnant, and socially destructive. The prescription for the cure rests with the accurate diagnosis of the disease. A people who began a national life inspired by a vision of society of brotherhood can redeem itself, but redemption can come only through a humble acknowledgement of guilt and an honest knowledge of self." So timely. I was just blown away by it's almost kind of sad that it's prescient that we're still dealing with this, but the logic of it really nails it. Okay, last couple of chapters. Chapter 4 is called The Dilemma. Chapter 4 is called The Dilemma. Here's where we come to where the previous threads all tie together. The conclusion that we need to reach down and alter the very basis upon which we think a good society is built. Dr. King writes, "All these questions remind us that there is a need for a radical restructuring of the architecture of American society. For its very survival's sake, America must re-examine old presuppositions and release itself from many things that for centuries have been held sacred. For the evils of racism, poverty, and militarism to die, a new set of values must be born. Our economy must become more person-centered than property and profit-centered. Our government must depend more on its moral power than its military power." How do we accomplish this restructuring despite all the forces that work against it? Dr. King writes, "The only answer to the delay, double-dealing, tokenism, and racism that we still confront is through mass nonviolent action and the ballot. At times, these may seem too slow and inadequate, but they are the only real tools that we have. Our course of action must lie neither in passively relying on persuasion, nor in actively succumbing to violent rebellion, but in a higher synthesis that reconciles the truths of these two." Chapter 5, Where Are We Going? In this chapter, Dr. King gets into the practicalities of power for those who would make change, saying, "In our society, power structures are sometimes obscure and indistinct, yet they can always finally be traced to those forces we describe as ideological, economic, and political." For ideological power, he holds up nonviolent demonstration as the best way to demonstrate dignity and change the minds and hearts of beings. For economic power, he gives basically one big solution, which is support organized labor. I'll let you read more about that, but I wasn't expecting that particular one as this is the thing to do. He cites in that section the fact that automation, why can't I pronounce that word? I don't know. Automizing things skims off workers into service industries, which are generally less unionized than production industries, at least in that day. But on the other hand, labor has a need to promote diversity and harmony within its ranks. So he actually felt that like on the factory floor was the place where you break down the divisions between made up races that don't actually exist and teach people that people are people and that you can share goals and work together to accomplish them. He also mentions massive boycotts, such as you might have massively boycotted Twitter recently for ethical reasons. Similarly, I just saw a petition going around that you could look up and sign if you want to keep Trump from getting his Facebook account back. That's up right now. These are practical on the ground examples of where this type of power can be used. As for political power, he says, "And so we shall have to do more than register and more than vote. We shall have to create leaders who embody virtues we can respect and who have moral and ethical principles we can applaud with an enthusiasm that enables us to rally support for them based on confidence and trust." Basically, if you want people to vote, hold up good people as political candidates. "We will have to demand high standards and give consistent, loyal support to those who merit it. We will have to be a reliable constituency for those who prove themselves to be committed political warriors on our behalf." And he rounds that chapter out with lucid arguments for universal basic income. Final chapter, we made it. The World House. This section is all just quotes. Dr. King says, "All inhabitants of the globe are now neighbors. This worldwide neighborhood has been brought into being largely as a result of the modern scientific and technological revolutions. The world of today is vastly different from the world of just 100 years ago." And finally, the same words we opened with. "But today, our very survival depends on our ability to stay awake, to adjust to new ideas, to remain vigilant, and to face the challenge of change. The large house in which we live demands that we transform this worldwide neighborhood into a worldwide brotherhood. Together we must learn to live as brothers, or together we will be forced to perish as fools. We must work passionately and indefatigably to bridge the gulf between our scientific progress and our moral progress. One of the great problems of mankind is that we suffer from a poverty of the spirit which stands in glaring contrast to our scientific and technological abundance. The richer we have become materially, the poorer we have become morally and spiritually." Dr. King calls for an all-out international war on poverty while simultaneously avoiding neocolonialism, and argues well for such a spirit, saying, "From time immemorial, people have lived by the principle that self-preservation is the first law of life. But this is a false assumption. I would say that other preservation is the first law of life. It is the first law of life precisely because we cannot preserve self without being concerned about preserving other selves. The universe is so structured that things go awry if people are not diligent in their cultivation of the other regarding dimension. I cannot reach fulfillment without thou. So thank you so much for your patient attention. I don't know if that was a stretch to sit and listen to me read a bunch of those words, but I personally found those words deeply inspiring and helpful to real life problems today, as I hope to continue to be an ally to communities of color, as well as face all the various struggles that all of us are facing. I find these words hit right to the heart of it. So your homework, should you choose to accept it, is to read or reread Where Will We Go From Here? Chaos or Community by the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Let me give you these closing words and then we'll sing it out. In short, we must shift the arms race into a peace race. If we have the will and determination to mount such a peace offensive, we will unlock hitherto tightly sealed doors of hope and bring new light into the dark chambers of pessimism. The stability of the large world house which is ours will involve a revolution of values to accompany the scientific and freedom revolutions engulfing the earth. We must rapidly begin the shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society. For our closing hymn today, let's change it up and we will sing in this spirit, We Shall Overcome. Sing this song out to all of those who overcame, worked to help us overcome, and all the things that we shall help each other overcome. Please rise. here this morning. Please enjoy each other's company and have a happy Dr. Martin Luther King Day tomorrow.